They will tell you this story never happened. They will tell you that the courthouse fire was an accident, that the records were lost by chance, that 3 daughters of a reverend simply married well and vanished into polite society. But lies have a certain odor. You can smell them if you listen long enough. South Carolina, 1827. In a parish where the hymns still echoed through the pines, 3 young women disappeared, and the man who claimed to shepherd souls paid off a fortune in debts that no preacher's salary could ever touch. The whispers said he had found another kind of currency, one older than gold, older than land. Flesh, virginity, the innocence of his own daughters. Do not comfort yourself by thinking this was just one man's sin. You would be a fool to believe that. Josiah Pendleton was not a monster in isolation. He was a servant of a system, a willing cog in a machine of shadows. His debts were not to poor men desperate for coin. They were to Charleston's most powerful, a judge who held the law in his fist, a doctor who kept the secrets of life and death, a merchant who owned the very notes of survival, and a planter whose land sprawled like an empire. Men bound together not by brotherhood, but by appetite. They called it the Circle, though the true name has been erased. Their power was simple: control the vulnerable, consume what others dare not touch, and erase the traces when it was done. Pendleton thought he was choosing survival. He thought he was saving his family from ruin. But what he was really doing was feeding his bloodline into the furnace of a hidden order. What do you think happened when his eldest daughter stepped into the house of Charles Drayton? Do you think she became a wife? No, she became a ledger line erased, a debt canceled in flesh. And within a week, she would vanish, swallowed whole, leaving behind only whispers. Understand this. This is not a tale of the past. It is the blueprint. The powerful have always bartered with the poor. You must understand, debts are not about money. They are about control. A man who owes another man is no longer free, and Reverend Josiah Pendleton was not simply in debt. He was owned. He thought himself a shepherd of souls, a servant of God. But when the Circle summoned him into that back room, laid the papers on the table, and tallied his ruin, he ceased to be a preacher. He became property. They knew it. He knew it. The only question was how far he would go to preserve the mask of holiness that kept him alive. The Circle did not demand cash because they did not need it. They wanted something more precious: obedience. And what better test of obedience than forcing a father to place his own daughters on the altar? That was the ritual. They called it marriage, but it was no covenant. It was bondage without chains, contracts without ink. Josiah's girls, Catherine, Mary, and Abigail, were not chosen because of beauty alone. They were chosen because they carried his blood. By consuming them, the Circle consumed him. By taking their innocence, they hollowed out the man of God and made him theirs forever. Imagine the Reverend pacing in his study that winter, the fire burning low, his wife staring at him with eyes that had begun to see through the mask. He could have confessed. He could have resisted. He could have told the truth to his congregation and let the Circle be exposed to the light. But men like Pendleton never do. Power does not fear God's wrath. It fears exposure. And Josiah was too weak to be the one who tore the veil. So he told his wife it was for the girl's security. He told himself it was for survival. He told God nothing, because the silence from heaven had already broken him. And the daughters? Catherine, the eldest, looked into her father's eyes and called him a liar. Mary wept, pleading with him to reconsider. Abigail, the clever one, tried to calculate a way out. But what is a daughter's resistance against the crushing weight of systemic power? Would I? The night was cold when the Reverend drove his eldest daughter to the plantation. February 14th, 1827. A date wrapped in irony, because what the world calls a day of love, Josiah knew as the night he sold his firstborn. The wagon wheels cracked over the frozen road, the lantern throwing trembling shadows over the trees. Beside him, Catherine sat silent, her face pale but unbroken. She had not screamed. She had not begged. She had only looked at him with eyes that pierced, as if she wanted him to see himself for what he had become. That silence was heavier than any sob. At the gates of the Drayton estate, a figure waited in the glow of the porch light. Charles Drayton, the man of the largest plantation in the parish, a man twice Catherine's age. He welcomed them with the courtesy of a gentleman, glass of whiskey in hand, but in his eyes flickered something else, hunger disguised as hospitality. He greeted Catherine as though she were a bride, but she knew, and her father knew, that she was an offering. Drayton handed Josiah a folded slip of paper. $2,000, Mark paid in full. The Reverend's trembling hand closed around it, and in that instant, something shifted. Flesh had been converted to numbers, innocence transmuted into debt erased. The exchange was complete. Catherine climbed the steps, her cloak brushing the wood, and disappeared through the door. It closed behind her, and with it, the last trace of her freedom. Josiah stood in the cold, his breath white in the air, the sound of the latch still echoing in his ears. He wanted to tell himself it was temporary, that Catherine would be cared for, provided for, that this was not damnation but survival. Yet as he climbed into the wagon, he felt a hollowness gnaw his chest. He knew, in the marrow of his bones, that he had not just sold his daughter, he had sold himself. For nights afterward, the Reverend could not sleep. He waited for Catherine to return, to visit, to write. But no letter came, no word. Within a week, the house was colder after Catherine vanished. Her chair sat empty at the table, her voice absent from the hymns that once filled the small chapel. Sarah, the mother, said little. She moved like a ghost, her hands still kneading bread, still tending the garden, but her eyes were far away, burning with something too heavy to name. Josiah avoided her gaze. He buried himself in sermons, in scripture, in anything that could drown out the silence of his own household. But silence does not drown. It grows. And then the circle came calling again. This time, it was not Drayton, but Edmund Rutledge, the merchant whose store supplied the parish with everything from sugar to seed. He visited Josiah with courtesy, with the false warmth of a man pretending this was just business. He reminded him of the remaining balance, the debt still outstanding. He laid his hand on the Reverend's shoulder and told him Mary was next. She was worth $2,000 as well, enough to erase another portion of what Josiah owed, enough to keep the illusion of survival alive. Mary was different from her sister. Where Catherine had met her father's command with fire, Mary's soul was tender, made of song and softness. When Josiah told her of the arrangement, her tears came like a flood. She begged him, clutched his sleeve, swore she would work, that she would serve in any house, that she would sacrifice herself in labor if only she could remain free. But Josiah had already made his choice. He had already bent his neck beneath the circle. And in his twisted logic, he told himself this was mercy, that at least Mary would be clothed, housed, cared for, instead of starving in the gutter when ruin came. Sarah confronted him at last. She cornered him in his study, her hands trembling, her voice low and sharp like a blade. "You are not a father anymore," she said. "You are a broker of flesh." Josiah struck the desk with his fist and roared about obedience, about survival, about God's will. But the truth was playing God. Abigail Pendleton was not like her sisters. At 17, she had inherited her mother's sharpness and her father's talent for words. But unlike Josiah, she used her voice as a weapon, not a shield. When Catherine vanished, she asked questions. When Mary followed, she stopped asking and began watching. She kept a notebook hidden beneath the floorboard of her room, filling it with overheard conversations, with dates, with names. She noticed when her father's hands shook after visiting the circle. She noticed when strangers came to the house late at night, men dressed too finely to be parishioners, who spoke in whispers and left with smiles that reeked of secrets. Abigail understood the game. She knew the circle was not finished, and she knew she was next on their list. But resistance has its price. Sarah, broken by the loss of her first 2 daughters, whispered to Abigail in the dark, "Do not fight them, child. Do not make them punish you worse." The mother had already surrendered, her spirit crushed by the weight of systemic power. Josiah, meanwhile, walked with the false confidence of a man telling himself he still had choices. In truth, he was a man on a leash, and the circle had begun tugging hard. The final creditor was Dr. Lawrence Gallard, the physician, a man whose hands delivered children, stitched wounds, and buried more truth than any grave could hold. He visited Josiah in early April. His smile was calm, his voice smooth, but his words were venom. "Your youngest is due, Reverend, and when she is ours, your account will be clean." He said it as though speaking of grain, or livestock, or a debt of tobacco, as though a young woman's life was nothing more than arithmetic. Abigail overheard it. From the stairwell, in the dark, she listened. And when her father emerged, pale and trembling, she confronted him with eyes burning like coals. "You gave them, Catherine. You gave them Mary. You will not give them me." Her voice carried no plea, only defiance. Josiah. The circle had no patience for rebellion. To them, Abigail was not a daughter, not a soul, not even a body. They saw her only as an unsettled account. When word reached Dr. Gallard that she was resisting, he did not argue. He sent a message, folded in a fine envelope, delivered by a servant whose silence was paid for in coin. Inside was a single line: "Defiance is expensive." Nothing more. Josiah read those words with sweat gathering at his temples. He knew what they meant. When men like Gallard spoke of expense, they were not speaking of coin alone. Defiance meant punishment. Punishment meant ruin, perhaps for Abigail, perhaps for Sarah, perhaps even for the preacher himself. Josiah's debt might be paid in numbers, but his true account was spiritual, moral, eternal, and it was being collected with interest. Abigail, however, did not cower. She sharpened her defiance into a weapon. She began speaking in whispers to parish wives, planting seeds of doubt about the circle's influence. She left her notebook where her mother could find it, its pages filled with details that would shatter reputations if they ever reached the light. For the first time, the circle felt a flicker of risk. A girl with nothing left to lose is a dangerous thing. Sarah begged her to stop. "Child, you do not know what they are. They will erase you like they erased your sisters." But Abigail's voice was steady, better erased fighting than swallowed whole. She carried herself not as prey, but as someone preparing to expose predators. And that terrified Josiah more than any threat from the circle. He tried to preach harder, louder, thundering sermons about obedience, about sin, about the dangers of pride. But every word rang hollow, every verse tasted like ash. His congregation began to notice. His flock sensed the fracture in their shepherd's soul. And the circle? They tightened the leash. More visits, more whispers, more reminders that his final obligation had not yet been met. The pressure. Abigail did not wait for the circle to come for her. She struck first. One evening, while Josiah sat hunched over his desk, pretending to prepare a sermon, Abigail slipped out into the night with her hidden notebook pressed against her chest. She walked the dirt road to the home of Widow Campbell, one of the only women in the parish known for speaking plain truth when men preferred silence. Abigail laid out the story, the debts, the exchanges, the disappearances. She showed her the names, the dates, the signatures of payment her father tried to hide. The widow listened, her wrinkled face pale with horror, and when Abigail finished, she whispered, "Child, you carry a fire they will try to drown. Guard it well." Words spread faster than Abigail realized. Whispers found their way into kitchens, into sewing circles, into hushed conversations after church. Women began asking questions, tracing connections, noticing the gaps where Catherine and Mary had been erased. For the first time, the circle felt a fracture in their cloak of secrecy. Dr. Gallard sent a polite note to Josiah. "Your daughter is speaking too freely. Silence her, or we will." When Josiah confronted Abigail, he found her standing tall, her eyes blazing. "I will not be silent. I will not vanish like they did." He raised his hand to strike her, but she did not flinch. "Do it," she hissed. "Prove to yourself what you are, a man who beats his last daughter for daring to speak truth." His hand trembled and fell to his side. He could not hit her. She had grown beyond his control. But control was not his to grant anymore. That Sunday, after service, two finely dressed men appeared at the parsonage door. They carried no weapons, only a sealed letter from Judge Calhoun, another hand of the circle. It declared that Abigail was to be educated in Charleston under guardianship arranged by the circle itself. The law, the letter claimed, required her relocation for her own welfare, a legal mask for abduction. Abigail, the circle never shouted. They did not need to. Their power was measured not in volume, but in precision, the quiet destruction of anyone who forgot their place. And when Abigail tore the judge's letter, she crossed a line that could not be erased. The warning came swiftly. Widow Campbell's barn burned to the ground one night, the flames clawing at the sky until nothing remained but ash and silence. No one saw who lit the fire, but everyone knew. It was a message. This is what happens when you listen to the preacher's daughter. The widow stood among the embers, her face pale, her hands trembling, but she spoke no word. Fear had sealed her lips. For Abigail, it was confirmation. The circle did not merely consume. They erased. And now, anyone who stood beside her was marked. She returned home with smoke still lingering in her hair, her notebook clutched tighter than ever. They are not men, she told her mother in a hushed, shaking voice. They are a plague. Sarah, worn thin, begged her to stop. Abigail, they will destroy us all. You cannot win against them. But Abigail's eyes burned with a strange, desperate light. If I remain silent, I am already destroyed. They took Catherine. They took Mary. They will not take me without the world knowing what they are. Josiah, meanwhile, had begun to unravel. His sermons stumbled, his voice cracked in the pulpit, and behind closed doors he wept like a man already condemned. He saw the circle's wrath circling closer, and for the first time he began to fear not just for Abigail, but for himself. He knew what they were capable of. He had seen what happened to debtors who resisted. Ruin, public disgrace, sometimes disappearance. And now he saw that same shadow falling across his own doorstep. That night, Josiah dreamed of fire, of his chapel burning, his congregation scattering, his own name dragged through the mud while the circle watched, untouched, untouchable. He awoke drenched in sweat, whispering prayers that felt more Lee. Abigail knew the circle's power thrived on silence. The only weapon she possessed was voice, and her notebook had become her sword. But swords do no good if they never leave the sheath. She needed her words to escape, to find ears beyond the circle's reach. And so, in secret, she crafted a plan. One spring evening, she slipped into the parsonage's study, stole a handful of envelopes and the church's wax seal, and began to copy her notes into careful letters. Each was addressed to someone who might be able to resist the circle's grip. A Methodist preacher in Charleston known for denouncing corruption, a newspaperman rumored to despise Judge Calhoun, even a northern abolitionist whose pamphlets sometimes found their way downriver. Abigail did not know if any would help, but she knew silence meant certain death. Exposure at least offered chance. She entrusted the letters to Thomas Bell, a farmhand barely older than she was, whose family owed nothing to the circle and whose courage had not yet been broken. "If I vanish," she told him, her hands gripping his like iron, "you must see these delivered. Do not trust the post. Ride with them. Place them directly in the hands of the men named inside." Thomas, pale but resolute, swore he would. For 2 days, Abigail walked lighter, her heart pounding with the dangerous thrill of rebellion. She had struck against the invisible empire. She had planted a fuse. But on the 3rd day, Thomas did not appear at morning chores. By nightfall, his mother was screaming in the yard, clutching a bloody scrap of his shirt found by the riverbank. The boy had vanished, swallowed whole by the same silence that had devoured her sisters. Josiah confronted Abigail with shaking hands, his voice breaking with terror. "You've killed him. Do you see what you've done? They will destroy us now." But Abigail's eyes blazed through her tears. "No, father. They destroyed him, just as they destroyed Catherine, just as they destroyed Mary. And if I do win..." The circle had tolerated enough. Whispers were one thing. A barn fire, a vanished farmhand, those were warnings. But Abigail's defiance was becoming infection, An infection had to be cut out. They moved against her with precision. It began with the congregation. On a Sunday morning, Judge Calhoun himself appeared in Josiah's chapel, dressed in black, his cane tapping the wooden floor as he walked to the front pew. His presence was a dagger drawn in daylight. The whispers spread instantly. What business had a judge in this tiny church? Josiah faltered in his sermon, his voice cracking as sweat dripped from his brow. And then, at the close of service, the judge stood. His words were measured, his tone calm, but every syllable struck like a hammer. It has come to my attention that lies are being spread. Dangerous lies. I caution this congregation. Such talk leads only to ruin. And ruin, once chosen, cannot be undone. Every eye turned to the Pendleton pew. Abigail sat tall, unblinking, staring back at him like steel. She did not look away. For the first time, the circle's warning was public. And for the first time, Abigail declared her defiance, not with words, but with her unbroken gaze. A 17-year-old girl staring down the law itself. That night, Josiah raged. He cursed her stubbornness, accused her of bringing damnation upon the family. But beneath his fury was fear. He knew the circle would not stop at warnings now. They would act. And when they acted, there would be no appeal, no mercy, no God to intervene. Only silence. Abigail retreated to her room, her notebook open, her candle burning low. For the first time, doubt clawed at her. What if her mother was right? What if fighting only quickened the inevitable? But as the wax dripped, she felt something deeper stirring, a grim clarity. This was no longer about survival. Survival was a cage. The circle's true power was not in taking lives, but in forcing silence. To defeat them, she could not simply run. The circle thought fear would silence her. They had watched her father bend, her mother fracture, her sisters vanish into the shadows of arrangements. But Abigail was different. She had not been broken. She had been sharpened. What they mistook for weakness in youth was, in truth, an unclaimed weapon, and she was ready to wield it. Alone in her room, she devised rituals of resistance. Every night, she wrote with her own blood in the margins of her Bible, not prayers, but warnings. Every dawn, she walked barefoot to the river, whispering to the water her vow, "I will not be erased." To her, these were more than gestures. They were incantations of identity, symbols strong enough to root her spirit when the circle came to uproot her body. Her mother watched silently, torn between terror and pride. She knew what Abigail was doing, preparing to die standing rather than live on her knees. And in that choice, Sarah recognized something she herself had never claimed, the courage to turn pain into power. But here is where the descent turns toward you, the listener. Because history repeats itself, not with the same names, not with the same costumes, but with the same mechanics. The circle never died. It simply changed form. In your world, it lives through corporations, governments, invisible contracts written in fine print. You are told you are free, while every chain is disguised as convenience. You are told to stay silent, while every word is harvested, every choice guided. And if you dare resist, they mark you for ruin. So the question is not whether Abigail's fight belongs to you. It does. The question is whether you are willing to accept the same transformation she did. The transformation from pawn to weapon, from silence to fire. I want you to prove it. Right now, in the comments, write these words: "I will not be erased. I will not be erased." Write it twice as ritual. That is not for me. That is for you. To cross the threshold. To lock in the identity of a man who. The circle understood something Josiah never did. The mind collapses long before the body. Chains are not forged of iron. They are woven from whispers. And so, when Abigail would not bow, they did not drag her into the night. They dragged the entire parish into the theater of her destruction. It began with subtle remarks, carried like disease on every tongue. Women in the marketplace shook their heads when she passed, muttering about a daughter too proud for obedience. Children whispered that her sisters had run because Abigail had cursed them. Men spat in the dirt as she walked by, calling her unwomaned, possessed a curse upon the Reverend's house. These were not their own words. They were scripts fed to them by the circle, rehearsed until the community no longer remembered where the thought had come from. Her father turned preacher against her. From the pulpit, he thundered about disobedient daughters, women who defied their fathers and brought ruin upon their households. Though he never spoke her name, every eye turned toward her pew, every hymn laced with accusation. Sarah tried to shield her daughter, but even her love was twisted into a weapon. She was told, repeatedly, persistently, that a good mother would break her daughter's will for the sake of the family. Her silence became complicity. Abigail understood what was happening. This was not punishment. This was isolation. They were cutting her off, thread by thread, until she stood alone against the machine. A lesser mind would have bent beneath the pressure, convinced itself it was safer to yield. That is how the circle fed, not on blood, not on flesh, but on surrender. But Abigail had already declared her vow. She had written it in blood, whispered it to the river. She could not break without erasing herself, and she would not give them that victory. Instead, she began to see their tactics for what they were, mirrors of the same game still played in your own time. The social smear campaigns. The circle wanted her silent. They wanted her bowed. They wanted her erased. But Abigail had been watching. While they tried to isolate her, she studied their patterns, listened to their rhythms. Like any predator, they believed themselves invisible, yet their habits betrayed them. She saw when Drayton's overseers rode into town. She noticed which clerks slipped letters into Judge Calhoun's hand. She even marked the physician's carriage, the way he always traveled with a locked satchel chained to his wrist. Abigail understood. If she was to resist, she could not simply endure. She had to strike, not with weapons, not with fists, but with exposure. The circle fed on secrecy. Their crimes were shadows. Her rebellion would be light. Late one night, she crept in her father's study. The room reeked of stale ink and brandy, the smell of his slow decay. But in the bottom drawer, beneath sermons and ledgers, she found it, an accounting written in his hand. Every dollar lost, every debt signed, every note forgiven with the names of his daughters scrawled in the margins. Josiah had kept record of his betrayal. Proof. Abigail pressed the paper to her chest, her hands trembling. This was more than evidence. This was a dagger aimed at the circle's heart. To wield it was dangerous, suicidal even. But to keep it hidden was to accept her fate. And so she made her choice. 2 days later, at Sunday service, she walked into the chapel not as a trembling daughter, but as a woman carrying fire. When her father began his sermon about obedience, she rose from her pew. Her voice cut through the air. Tell them, Father. Tell them how much my virtue was worth in your ledger. Tell them what you sold Catherine for. Tell them why Mary vanished. The congregation gasped. Josiah froze, pale as ash. Abigail held the paper high, her hand steady. They traded our blood for his debts. The circle feeds on silence. But I will not be erased. Chaos erupted. Mothers pulled children close. Men shouted. The circle never tolerated spectacle. Power survives in silence, not in scandal. Abigail's defiance inside the chapel had ripped a hole in the veil, and through that tear, the congregation glimpsed something monstrous. The circle could not allow it to widen. Their response had to be immediate, merciless, and precise. The very next day, proclamations appeared nailed to the doors of shops, taverns, even the church itself. They bore Judge Calhoun's seal. Let it be known, Abigail Pendleton is afflicted with hysteria, a malady of the female mind. Her ravings are unfit for Christian ears. Her words are not testimony, but disease. To heed them is to invite contagion. The people obeyed. They did not see a young woman exposing predators. They saw a cautionary tale of madness. Mothers whispered to their daughters, "Obey your fathers, or you will end like her." Men shook their heads, pitying Josiah for having such a cursed child. The circle had inverted her rebellion into proof of her insanity. And then came the second strike. Josiah was called to Charleston under the pretense of church business. When he returned, his eyes were hollow, his hands trembling. That night, he told Sarah the truth. If Abigail continued, he would be stripped of his pulpit, cast out of the parish, their family reduced to beggars. "She is condemning us all," he muttered. "If she will not bend, I must break her." The circle had turned father into enforcer, not with chains, but with fear of ruin. And in this, they revealed their true mastery. They did not need to kill Abigail outright. They would make her family do it for them, through betrayal, through restraint, through forced silence. But Abigail had already crossed the threshold. She could feel in her bones. Every humiliation, every whispered slander, every attempt to erase her only fueled the fire within. She understood the deeper horror. The circle did not simply own men's debts. They owned the very definitions of sanity, morality, even God. They came for her at night, always at night. That was the circle's rhythm. When the town slept, when no witness could stand between them and their prey. Abigail heard them before she saw them. Boots grinding against gravel, the groan of carriage wheels, the low murmur of men rehearsing cruelty. By the time the knock thundered against the Pendleton door, Sarah was already weeping. She knew this was the moment her daughter would be taken. Josiah opened the door with trembling hands. Standing on the porch was Judge Calhoun himself, flanked by two overseers with whips coiled at their belts. Behind them, the physician, his satchel gleaming with brass clasps in the moonlight. And there, watching from the shadows, Drayton's men, silent, faceless, waiting. "The girl is ill," Calhoun declared. "She will be escorted to receive treatment. Resistance will be remembered as sin." His voice carried the cold weight of inevitability. This was not an arrest. This was a sentence. Sarah clung to Abigail, her nails digging crescents into her daughter's arms. "Run," she whispered. "Please run." But Abigail shook her head. Running would only delay the inevitable. Tonight was not the time for flight. It was the time for confrontation. The overseers stepped forward. Josiah moved aside. That betrayal cut deeper than any lash could. A father choosing pulpit over blood. Abigail looked into his eyes, and for the first time, she felt nothing. No anger, no grief. Only clarity. He was not her shield. He never had been. He was part of the circle, whether by cowardice or by design. They seized her wrists, dragging her toward the carriage. The townsfolk watched from shuttered windows, silhouettes trembling behind candlelight. None came forward. None spoke. Silence had been bought too dearly. Abigail's bare feet scraped across the stones, but she did not cry out. She would not give them the sound of her fear. As they bound her hands and shoved her into the carriage, she whispered a vow so low only. The carriage rattled through endless pine forests until dawn bled across the horizon. When it finally stopped, Abigail was dragged into an estate on the outskirts of Charleston, Drayton's sanctuary, a mansion polished with stolen wealth and sustained by human ruin. Here, the circle performed their most secret work. Here, girls vanished and never returned the same. They did not lock her in chains. No, their methods were subtler, crueler. They placed her in a room with silk curtains, a gilded bed, food rich enough to sicken her stomach. It was a gilded cage. Drayton himself greeted her with a smile too polished to be human. "You are free here," he said, "but only once you learn what freedom truly is. Freedom is obedience. Freedom is silence." The days blurred into a suffocating theater of control. The physician dosed her with tinctures that clouded her mind, then asked her to repeat prayers until her tongue grew numb. The overseer stood outside her door, whispering through the night, describing the fates of other girls who had resisted, stories of madness, of disappearances, of shallow graves that no one ever dug up. Judge Calhoun arrived each week to test her, forcing her to recite words of submission, recording her answers like sacred scripture. This was the circle's ritual, to unmake the will, to erase the self, to sculpt silence where there once had been fire. It was psychological crucifixion, and Abigail could feel the edges of her mind fraying. Sleep came in jagged fragments. Hunger twisted her stomach. Her own reflection began to mock her, whispering that perhaps she was mad after all. But still, the vow burned in her chest. I will not be erased. When they forced her to repeat their prayers, she mouthed the words, but in her mind, she carved daggers of defiance. When they whispered threats through the door, she imagined their voices drowned in fire. When they tried to convince her she was alone, she remembered the river, the blood-stained Bible, the oath no. Abigail had been in Drayton's estate for weeks, though time had lost its meaning. Days melted into nights, rituals into punishments, voices into chains. Yet something inside her refused to dissolve. The circle thought they had hollowed her into obedience. But what they had created instead was clarity. She understood now. Survival was no longer the goal. Victory lay in one thing only, making the truth impossible to bury. One evening, during another forced recital, Judge Calhoun demanded she proclaim her obedience before the circle gathered in Drayton's parlor. The men lounged in velvet chairs, sipping brandy, smirking at the young woman they believed was broken. The physician placed a quill and ledger before her. "Sign," he said. "Confess your delusions, confess your sins, and all will be forgiven." Abigail looked at the paper, at the waiting faces, at her father, seated silently in the corner, his eyes red from drink, unable to meet hers. She lifted the quill. For a moment, it seemed she might yield. The circle leaned forward, hungry for her collapse. Instead, she dipped the quill into her own wrist. A crimson line bloomed across her skin, and with that blood, she scrawled across their ledger, not her submission, but her prophecy. "I will not be erased." The words bled into the paper, stark, undeniable. She held it high, her voice cutting through the chamber. "You may silence me. You may bury me. But every debt you have paid in flesh will rise from the ground. Your names will not be forgotten. They will be curses." The room erupted. Overseers surged forward. Calhoun shouted for her restraint. Josiah cried out in horror as the quill was torn from her hand. But it was too late. The damage was done. Her words were no longer hers alone. They were carved into the circle's own records, preserved in the very book they used to bind others. For a moment, silence fell. Not submission, but something colder. Fear. They had seen it. They had heard it. And deep in their bones, they could not let her live. Not after what she had written, not after what she had spoken in their chamber. The circle thrived on secrets, and Abigail had forced their corruption into daylight. Her blood on their ledger was not just defiance. It was contamination. A seed of rot inside their carefully tended mask of respectability. That night, they ended her. No trial, no grave marked. The physician signed a death note citing hysteria of the blood. Josiah delivered a trembling sermon of loss, his words written for him by Judge Calhoun. Drayton ordered her body hidden where no one would stumble upon it. To the town, Abigail Pendleton simply disappeared, as if she had been swallowed whole by the swamp. But the circle miscalculated. They believed erasure was as simple as silence. Yet silence is never empty. It echoes. Whispers spread in taverns, in kitchens, in hushed corners of the marketplace. Mothers told daughters about the girl who defied judges. Fathers warned sons of the name Abigail, spoken like a curse, like a fire that would not go out. And hidden deep in Drayton's estate, in a locked ledger that no flame ever touched, her words remained, "I will not be erased." The circle covered their crime, but they could not scrub the unease, because men like them fear more than exposure. They fear memory, and memory is exactly what Abigail became. Now her shadow stretches across centuries to this very moment. You, listening to my voice, have inherited the same crossroads she stood upon. The circle may not ride carriages to your door, but they ride algorithms, they ride laws, they ride debts, they ride the invisible contracts you sign without seeing. They still whisper, they still smear, they still weaponize obedience against you. The only question is whether you, like Abigail, will bow, or whether you will carve your defiance into their systems, even if it costs you. Because the truth is this: her body was buried, but her defiance lives on in every man who dares to SE.